I'm Ari Goldstein, Senior Public Programs Producer at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. And it's a pleasure to welcome you to today's very timely program on Nazi hunting past and present. Before we introduce our guests today, I'll turn things over to our partners at the ADL for some words of welcome.
Thank you, Ari. Good afternoon. My name is Susie Davidowitz, and I am pleased to serve as a board member of ADL New York, New Jersey. I am personally deeply committed to the concept of never again and have devoted my volunteer energy to doing all that I can to ensure this is the case. Bringing Nazis and neo-Nazis to justice is an incredibly important way to live that credo, which is why I'm so pleased to welcome all of you on behalf of the Anti-Defamation League, ADL, to today's special program on Nazi hunting. This is an issue that is woven into the DNA of ADL, beginning with the organization's education of Americans in the 1930s about the dangers that homegrown Nazi movements in America posed to democracy, especially the anti-Semitic German-American Bund. During World War II, ADL launched a massive research operation undercover to find Nazi supporters and hate groups in the US, making its findings available to government agencies in Washington, D.C., and to the press. Increasingly, the FBI and the media turned to ADL for its expertise, which launched an important relationship with law enforcement that continues to this day. All of this work eventually evolved into ADL's Center on Extremism, which monitors extremism across the ideological spectrum. ADL staff of investigators, analysts, researchers, and technical experts strategically monitors, exposes, and disrupts extremist threats on the internet and on the ground. It is considered to be the foremost authority on extremism, terrorism, and hate, both foreign and domestic. Just Google ADL and Center on Extremism to learn more and to view the ADL's interactive heat map, a first of its kind interactive and customizable map detailing hate, extremist and anti-Semitic incidences by state and nationwide. Apropos of today's topic, a critical part of the center's work is tracking and exposing white supremacists. For example, in March of this year, the FBI arrested white supremacist Paul N. Miller on 3 federal weapons charges. ADL Center on Extremism had identified him 5 months earlier as a volatile white supremacist who was using increasingly radical and violent rhetoric, as well as displaying weapons and real-life extremist-related activities. ADL Center on Extremism reported him to federal law enforcement authorities in New Jersey. This is why today's program is so important to ADL. We are extremely grateful to the Museum of Jewish Heritage, to Integrity First for America, and to Eli Rosenbaum and the Department of Justice for making it possible. Thank you all so much for tuning in.
Thank you, Susie. And it's all of our honor at the museum to count ADL as our co-presenter today. Our other co-presenter is Integrity First for America. As Susie mentioned, Integrity First for America is leading the charge in Sines v. Kessler, the federal lawsuit that's seeking to bankrupt and dismantle the hate groups that marched in Charlottesville, Virginia at the deadly 2017 Unite the Right rally. The trial is set to begin in less than 40 days, so this is an urgent and discussion. Karen Dunn and Amy Spitalnick, joining us on today's panel, are 2 members of the team behind Sines v. Kessler, Karen as leading litigator and Amy as executive director of Integrity First for America. Welcome, Karen and Amy. Eli Rosenbaum is the former director of the Office of Special Investigations at the US Department of Justice and is now a senior official in its successor unit. He spent more than 3 decades identifying, denaturalizing, and deporting World War II Nazi war criminals and exposing the hidden Nazi past of public figures. Moderating today's discussion is John Avlon, senior political analyst at CNN. Among other projects, John is the creator and host of Reality Check Extremist Beat, a new CNN series on the roots of QAnon, which will premiere tonight on CNN.com. Please feel free to share questions for our panelists as they get into the discussion, and we'll take as many as we can towards the end of the hour. Without further ado, a warm welcome to all of you. Feel free to get started.
Thank you, Ari, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Nazi hunting is a term which captures people's attention, but it is not simply a past preoccupation as ongoing lawsuits involving the Unite the Right rally show. But Eli, I want to begin with you because you are distinguished as, in some cases, America's preeminent Nazi hunter within the Department of Justice. Tell us what that means in real terms. What does it mean to be a Nazi hunter working for the DOJ? Eli, I think you've got to unmute.
Forgive me, sorry. There's not a lot of competition for that title, of course, but there are a few of us still working on the Nazi cases, and we brought one and tried it in Memphis just last year, and we deported the individual, Friedrich Karlberger, just this year, obviously at a very late date. We don't have criminal jurisdiction in the World War II Nazi cases. That's not permitted under the US Constitution. So what we were left with when our program was belatedly launched at DOJ in 1979 was a civil jurisdiction for the most part. Denaturalization, that is civil revocation of naturalized US citizenship, trying the case in Article 3 Federal District Court, and then also follow-on deportation proceedings in immigration court, what we today tend to call removal proceedings. If a foreign government requested extradition, which hardly has ever happened, then that's an expedited process that kind of sounds in criminal law. And we would handle those as well with colleagues elsewhere in the Justice Department. So I'm not a big fan of the expression Nazi hunting. It makes it seem like something other than it is. What it is a professional and very challenging law enforcement work, but I've made my peace with it. I've heard it often enough.
Well, I think the important point that provides continuity between you and Karen and Amy is that justice and accountability in America is achieved through the law. Karen, you have a very different career trajectory, although you have done time in the federal government, so to speak. But tell us about the case that you and Amy are bringing with regards to the Unite the Right rally, which is scheduled to go to trial in next month.
So, well, first of all, thank you for having me. And it's true, my roots are as a lawyer for the government and as a federal prosecutor. So this is the case that I've done in private practice that most resembles the cases I used to bring as a prosecutor. We have brought on behalf of 10 plaintiffs who were injured in the events of August 11th and 12th, 2017, a case under the Ku Klux Klan Act for a conspiracy to commit racially motivated violence in Charlottesville. And so we are, as it's always kind of chilling when you hear how many days you are from trial, but we are fewer than 40 days from trial. It starts October 25th. Our defendants in this case are the leaders of the white supremacist and neo-Nazi movement in the country today. Some familiar names, Richard Spencer, Matthew Heimbach, Jason Kessler, and others who organized and executed events that were violent and resulted in death and grievous injury, including to our very brave plaintiffs. So our work is very different than what Eli does so wonderfully, but I think there are really common threads and mission to what we and he are doing.
And Amy, I understand you had a ruling just last night, which was pretty significant in terms of the trajectory of the case. Tell us about that.
Absolutely. And again, thank you to all of you for being here and for having us. And this is a particular honor for me to get to be a part of this discussion because I'm the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. And so this is very meaningful to be with Eli and of course, the museum, which has been an incredible partner in this work and in telling the story of what has actually happened, which is really what this case is about. I think it's about making clear the facts of that horrific weekend 4 years ago, the violent ideology that underpins how these groups operate and these leaders operate, and of course, winning justice and accountability at a time when it has been so sorely lacking. And to that point, even before we get to trial, Karen and our team have been tireless in holding the defendants accountable to their obligations. And just last night, we won really, I think, significant, stunning evidentiary sanctions against a key neo-Nazi defendant, Robert Asmodor Ray, who some of you might know because he was a prolific writer for the neo-Nazi site, The Daily Stormer, and notoriously violently participated and helped organize the Unite the Right violence, including with a very notorious anti-Semitic banner that I won't repeat the words that they carried here, but you can certainly read in our complaint. And what these evidentiary sanctions did is effectively establish as fact in this case that Ray entered into an agreement with co-conspirators to engage in racially motivated violence in Charlottesville that weekend 4 years ago, and a number of other facts that are really at the heart of our lawsuit. So establishing these facts even before we get to trial is crucial for a number of reasons. And I think it also is really a perfect example of the impact this case has had, the success this case has had, even before we get to trial. When we go to trial, we have the potential to win large judgments against these defendants and can effectively bankrupt, disrupt, and dismantle them, these individuals and these organizations. And that is important for the accountability that they need to face. It's important for the deterrent effect that creates for others. But even before trial, we've had defendants not just face major evidentiary sanctions like Robert Ray or Elliot Klein, who have had similar sanctions against him. We've also had major financial penalties, 5-figure sanctions, and in fact, Richard Spencer, perhaps one of our most notorious defendants, has called this case, quote, financially crippling. And so this shows us that if you are going to flout court orders, if you're not going to follow the rule of law, you will actually face consequences even before we get to trial. And I think it's been particularly heartening to watch our legal team make sure that these defendants live up to their obligations. And that if they don't, they face consequences like this, which will have an enormous impact when trial starts just next month.
What a concept. I must say that it's interesting to see judges enforce these mechanisms even before trial, because I think that often does not happen in cases. Eli, pull back for a second. Tell us, how the U.S. government get involved in this line of work, which I know you reluctantly accept is called Nazi hunting. But what was the entry point and the legal innovations that were put forth in the early days?
Well, in the first few decades after World War II, the Justice Department and its then Immigration and Naturalization Service component tried to bring Nazi cases, and they routinely failed. There were a couple of victories, and that's all. And they failed because these cases are extraordinarily challenging. I mean, imagine trying to prove facts, crimes that took place decades earlier, far away from the United States, crimes that were committed in a manner intended to physically eliminate those people who would have been inclined, I think, to cooperate with a government investigation. Finally, and this is sort of a typical Washington story, right? The New York Times and other newspapers in the 70s started focusing on the fact that there appeared to be Nazi criminals, not just in Germany, not just in Austria and South America, but even in the United States. That caught the attention of Congress, especially then Congresswoman Elizabeth Holtzman. She and others precipitated hearings. The hearings were covered by the media. Finally, there was a critical mass of outrage in the country, and the Carter administration was pressured to set up a special unit in the criminal division at DOJ, and that's what they did. And I think the approach that we've taken is of a piece with the famous Justice Department strategy in the Al Capone case, right? I mean, he was a major mobster in Chicago, killed lots of people, or lots of people were killed on his orders. DOJ could never prove it. In the end, what they were able to bring was a tax fraud case, and we won that long before I was born, and jailed him. So you take what authorities you have. That's what we did in the Nazi cases, right? We took civil denaturalization, civil deportation, and I dare say that Integrity First is doing the same thing, right? They have found good authorities in the law. The Ku Klux Klan Act, hardly ever used, but it may work. And so you use what you can to pursue the rule of law and some measure of justice.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I'm fascinated by the fact, Karen, that your team is using the 1871 KKK Act. I'm just finishing a book on Lincoln and the fight for peace, and so I've been reading and writing a lot about this. How does it apply, and how did you discover that it was the best precedent, the best remedy to draw upon?
Yeah, so the KKK Act, as you say, was a Reconstructionist era statute designed to protect Blacks in the South, really, at the time that it was passed. And we can never talk about this without expressing some incredible regret that in the year 2021, this is the most applicable statute, and that it's such a good fit for our case. And essentially, this is shorthand, but it prohibits conspiracy to do racially motivated violence or conspiracies to deprive other people of their civil rights, which is what happened in Charlottesville. And so the sad fact is it does appear to be more or less a good fit for the fact of our case, which was premeditated, planned acts of that reasonably foreseeable violence would occur, and motivated by racial animus. And under the law, hatred of Jews is included in the concept of legally of racial animus. And so, if you're looking around for, under what statute is this conduct for which people can be held civilly liable, this is a statute. The other reason it's very useful here is because it creates a private right of action for individuals. So you don't have to be the government to bring a case under the KKK Act. You can be the people who were injured in Charlottesville that weekend. And so that is one reason that this is, along with other civil rights statutes that create these rights, it's sort of a piece of other statutes that are kind of on the rise actually in legal cases, which is sad to say, but helpful. And then we've also brought some claims that are really just tort claims, state law tort claims that, for intentional infliction of emotional distress and other injury.
Amy, I understand this case also draws upon precedent set in the Nuremberg trials. So explain.
Well, I think thematically, it certainly draws from the point of the Nuremberg trials, and in fact, just a couple months ago, Karen and I and one of our colleagues got to do an event with Project Nuremberg where they honored this case because it represents the spirit of the Nuremberg trials. And so I think while I'm not sure that there is a formal connection in that way, I think that in terms of the theme, in terms of the spirit of what the Nuremberg trials were about, this case squarely fits in the importance of seeking accountability and justice, even after the fact. In many cases, it has been 4 years since Charlottesville. It has been a long road towards accountability. I think 4 years in which we saw so little accountability, not just as it relates to Charlottesville, but certainly the broader cycle of extremism. And I think it's important to be clear about that accountability. It might be hard, it might be hard fought, as it certainly has been in this case, but it's so crucial that it happens when it finally happens, not just because those responsible deserve to be brought to justice, even if it's years after the fact, which I'm sure is a theme in Eli's work as well.
Sure.
But it is also important because it's that accountability that then serves as a deterrent to others who are looking on and seeing that there will actually be very real consequences for this sort of violence and this sort of extremism. And we're seeing that in this case. We're seeing how some have said they weren't going to return to Charlottesville in 2018 for another event because, quote, they didn't want to be sued again. Some defendants have said they can't open a new building or go about their business because of this lawsuit. And we're seeing that same sort of deterrent effect among some of their supporters who are recognizing the consequences. And so there is really, I think, a direct line that runs from the Nuremberg trials and runs, of course, through the work that Eli is doing to this case, because at the core, it's the very same concept of accountability and justice, no matter how hard fought and how long it takes.
Yeah, and I think that Nuremberg is a trial, and I particularly recommend people read or watch Justice Jackson's opening statement. I think that's something that should be more widely taught in American schools. It's a
Don, could I echo?
easy line, yes.
Echo what Amy said. I see another link, right? The Nuremberg trial, which mesmerized the world in 1945-46. And by the way, the 75th anniversary of the judgment of the tribunal is 8 days from now on October 1. So it's timely that we're discussing it now. That trial educated the world in many respects, including showing how hate speech, Nazi speech, and the dissemination of hatred using, especially using new technologies, in Hitler's case, radio, and also aviation, which enabled him to go all over the country and have these huge rallies, leads directly to violence. And that, of course, the harnessing of hate ideology, white supremacy, and neo-Nazism, the harnessing of that is what helped lead to the violence that shocked us all in Charlottesville.
I want to actually stay with you, Eli, because as someone who's devoted their life to, deporting, denaturalizing Nazis, and sees that cohort dwindling, by nature of time, how do you understand the persistence of Nazism? Even indeed the rise of it again in our society. I mean, as someone who's devoted their life to this, how do you make sense of that persistence of this particular strain of hate when it should have lost all legitimacy in the minds of every human being based on what we know?
I think, frankly, when I was much younger, including when I was a young prosecutor, it had lost almost all of its legitimacy. There were still pockets of it. I remember once having to make a trip inside the headquarters of the American Nazi Party, which outrageously was located right outside of Washington in Arlington, Virginia, almost a stone's throw from Arlington National Cemetery, where so many heroes are buried. But I think there were a number of factors that have contributed to its revival. One is certainly the internet, a technology that the American Nazi Party could not have dreamt of. They went out of business because they couldn't afford to pay the rent on their building or the printing of their hate-filled publications. Now, you don't need any money for that. You just need a computer and an internet account, and you can reach millions upon millions of people. I tend to think that in the United States, the other main contributing factor is the passing of the so-called greatest generation, the men and women who saved the world, as President Clinton said at Normandy years ago, in World War II. My dad was combat veteran of World War II. And I think back then, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, any person who would have dared to voice support for Nazis in the United States would have been taken to the woodshed by his dad, who would explain what he fought for. But those men are gone.
Karen, in the case to date, how do you understand? It can't just be historical ignorance that accounts for the recent rise in Nazism and white supremacy with Nazi iconography. I mean, how do you understand why we're seeing this now?
Well, so first of all, I think I should have talked to Eli a year ago because there is a lot of commonality in what he's saying and what we have seen in this case. I do think the accessibility to plan and coordinate with other people cannot be understated or cannot be overstated. So the events in Charlottesville were planned substantially on a platform called Discord, which was not invented for this purpose. It's primarily used by gamers to talk to one another, but it's an invitation only chat platform. And so, you know, much of the hate and the hate-filled communications and the planning happened on the Discord platform, not in person. And so, you know, the fact is, a gathering on the scale of the Unite the Right just would not, and you know, January 6th, frankly, would just not have been possible at any other earlier time in history without some organized political party. And so I think, you know, that is really unprecedented as far as we can tell. And I do think, you know, I think the way that Eli put it, I thought was really beautiful about the greatest generation. But there has been a shift of norms in our country, and things that are acceptable now never would have been acceptable before, for some combination of reasons. And I think we're really seeing that. I also think, you know, we at this point have deposed a lot of white supremacists. And one theme that clearly comes through is just their endemic frustration that, you know, is really driving a lot of this. And so that, you know, that obviously.
Karen, let me press you on that.
Yeah.
What kinds of frustrations lead one to become a Nazi?
Well, I think there are probably a lot of people who are frustrated who do not become Nazis.
Clearly,
but I will say it is does seem to be a common feature of a lot of the folks that we have spoken to in the course of our case, of just this frustration that there are other groups that have organizations and advocates, and they feel like there's nobody advocating for them. And obviously, this is not, you know, this goes in a direction that is terrible and that we can't countenance. But you know, I will say the passion on the other side, that's the other thing. You cannot minimize the vehemence and the strength of views that we are up against. I mean, it is very, very, very intense, obviously.
Is this like the quote unquote replacement theory? Is that?
Yes.
That's what I was just
That's one part of it. I mean, Amy speaks about this really eloquently, so she should do that. But it is, I think one thing I will say in this group, people understand a very tiny percentage of what's going on. We monitor this every day. And we, like Eli, have gone deep in the heart of what is going on. And I think that the vast majority of the American public understand a tiny little sliver of what is happening.
Yeah, and I wholeheartedly agree with both what Karen and Eli said. And I think it's important to understand just the point Karen was just making, that I think there are a lot of people who feel like perhaps there was an election, things have changed in this country, and the threat of extremism might have gone away after January 6th and after January 20th. And that is certainly not the case. I think we are in one of the most dire moments in recent history when it comes to the threat of violent extremism in this country. And Charlottesville, in so many ways, really was just the preview or the harbinger of that. And at the core of what happened in Charlottesville and in so many other incidents of violence over the last few years is the replacement theory that you mentioned, and what Karen was describing in terms of the frustrations and ideology of these defendants speaks precisely to this. That's the idea, sort of a quick refresher for those who don't know the term replacement theory. It's this idea that, like with so many conspiracy theories, many of the same conspiracy theories that motivated the original Nazis in the 30s and 40s, Jews are the puppet masters who are orchestrating the ills of society, or what they believe to be the ills of society. It could be a variety of ills. In the modern manifestation, it is demographic changes in this country, the particular success or strength of the Black community, like our first Black president, of the Black Lives Matter protests last summer, which brought attention to racial injustice, of course, immigration, refugees coming to this country in hopes of a better life. And so it manifests in very explicit, obvious ways. Like in Charlottesville, where they quite literally chanted, "Jews will not replace us." That's what they meant by that. In Pittsburgh, where the shooter specifically chose that synagogue because they work with HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, to support refugees of all backgrounds coming to this country. And of course, in so many other attacks, including the Chabad in Poway, the El Paso attack, and echoes of it on January 6th, when you hear about stopping the steal of this country, and some of the Nazi and Confederate paraphernalia that was found at the Capitol that day. And so we know it manifests in very explicit ways, and that there are also direct connections between these attacks. For example, the Pittsburgh shooter communicated with some of the Charlottesville leaders, the Christchurch shooter, who was motivated by the same ideology in his attack in New Zealand 2.5 years ago, donated to some of our Charlottesville defendants. And
Is that right?
To Richard Spencer and Andrew Anglin, and painted onto his gun a white power symbol popularized by a third defendant, Matthew Heimbach, the symbol known as the hashtag. Christchurch was live streamed and in turn inspired the Chabad attack in Poway, the El Paso attack. And so you really see these direct connections in which this ideology is obvious, it's explicit, and of course, it's really, really dangerous. I think equally dangerous to that is what Karen started to allude to, the ways in which some of extremism has been mainstream, how the norms in this country are starting to shift. And we are now seeing this ideology, this replacement theory, manifest in more mainstream forums. Last night, Tucker Carlson gave an explicit endorsement of it on Fox News, and that shouldn't be partisan to call that out. We've had elected officials literally espouse replacement theory in their official capacities, and they're not even trying to hide it in certain ways. They are explicitly talking about the replacement of white people in this country. And while it might not be violent neo-Nazis marching on the streets of Charlottesville chanting "Jews will not replace us," it has the very same intent, which is that it shows the norms in this country are changing. And I think in some ways it's more dangerous because it shows that norms are changing. And it gives a green light to extremists motivated by that hate, motivated by that ideology, to take action. And so I think we need to be clear-eyed about what motivated these attacks, how it connects to historical extremism and anti-Semitism. And Deborah Lipstadt has a fantastic expert report in our case that talks about just that we'll be sure to send around. But also be really clear-eyed about how it's becoming increasingly mainstreamed in recent years.
I think as Amy says so powerfully, I mean, we do indeed live in perilous times, times that I think most of us could never have imagined, even a few years ago. I think I should note that the Attorney General, Merrick Garland, has announced that significant additional resources are being deployed to fight, combat hate crimes. And also FBI Director Chris Wray testified the other day about a huge ramping up of domestic terrorism investigations. And they've had success. The FBI has had success in preventing hate violence, for example, last year in Las Vegas.
Yes, and as has been pointed out, Merrick Garland, of course, first guy that came to public prominence in his prosecution in the wake of Oklahoma City, to the extent that different forms of hate are connected on some level. But I want to stay there with you, Eli. I mean, given your perspective, having devoted a life to bringing ex-Nazis to justice, do you see explicit echoes in the rhetoric of hate that we see creeping into the mainstream today, or does it feel distinct?
It feels distinct in the sense that there's not a government directing what's happening, right? It's not the Nazi regime of the World War II era, but it's empowered greatly in different ways. And as Amy and Karen have said, a lot of the themes are the same. And so many of these people have access to weapons of various kinds, and so many of them use those weapons against innocent people. So the echo and the symbols that they use, the themes and symbols that they use definitely echo what the Nazis did and their acolytes in the 1930s and 40s.
Yeah, so one thing I want to add to this is I do think, and I am not the expert that Eli is, but I do think there's just a greater degree of misinformation that is utilized to sort of cloud what's going on. So I think whereas there was a certain amount of Nazism that, you know, was an organized political party, very much owned the actual violence and hate. Here, there is a desire to cast what is happening as jokes or violent acts that are really self-defense, which sometimes are violent acts that are provoked so that they can be violent acts, and then claim self-defense later. And so the tactics are actually quite sophisticated as far as encasing the intent to do violence and the execution of violence in things that seem more acceptable, like political rallies and self-defense and such. And so I actually, have come to believe it's very strategic. I think the writings, the articles there, it's very strategic what's going on and much less overt as far as the true intent. And I think that is, to me, that is a very likely difference between the modern era and the history.
I will say though that one thing that was used in the days of the KKK and its offshoot organizations, the White Citizens Councils and all that, was this tactic that you just described called aggressive defensiveness, where they would come into rallies and provoke violence and then use that as a justification for violence. I mean, some of this stuff really is kind of cut and pasted on the synaptic cord.
And that's what we're seeing right now in Portland and in so many other cities that are facing the sort of street fighting by the Proud Boys and other extremists. It's the very same sort of tactic.
Interesting. How much, Amy, have you, I mean, you alluded to this, but how you put the genie back in the bottle is always very difficult, especially when you've got decentralized groups and movements. And I think one common thread in this conversation is that the internet, social media, has made it possible to aggregate people whose extremist views might have alienated them in the past, right? But to what extent does the presence of these suits, has it shown specifically that it can take an organization and bankrupt it and diffuse it in meaningful ways?
It's been very clear that suits like this have impact. And if you look historically at some of the civil litigation brought against the KKK or against other extremist groups, like the Michael Donald case brought by the SPLC, in which ultimately Michael Donald, who was a victim of Klan violence, his mother won the deed to the Tuscaloosa headquarters of the KKK, and sort of now, well-known case, perhaps one of the best examples of how hate groups have been bankrupt through civil litigation like this. Similarly, a case actually brought by Karen's firm Paul Weiss in the 90s against the Nuremberg files, which was a far-right site targeting reproductive health clinics that effectively went after those groups, targeting those health professionals, bankrupt them, chase them around for the rest of their lives, collecting on those judgments. And so there's a strong history here. We know this works, and we're seeing it in this case with a lot of the defendants in our suit already marginalized thanks to this lawsuit. People like Richard Spencer, who 3 or 4 years ago was one of the leading neo-Nazis in this country, coining the term alt-right. And he himself has talked about how we've financially crippled him, quote unquote, and how he's no longer able to really go about his business. And we've heard similar comments from other defendants. I don't want to suggest that this suit is a silver bullet, though. It needs to go hand in hand with so much other work. It needs to go hand in hand with criminal prosecutions that, of course, Eli has alluded to in terms of January 6th and the other work coming out of the Garland DOJ. It needs to go hand in hand with not just federal action, but local and state action. Hate crimes in particular are central to, or really state and local prosecutions are central to holding those responsible for hate crimes accountable. In my prior life, I worked in the New York AG's office, and when we saw a spike in hate crimes after the 2016 election, we had to issue a bulletin to local governments and PDs, reminding them of their obligations to hold those responsible for hate crimes accountable. Where 2020, according to the FBI, was the worst year for hate crimes since 2001. So that is clearly another manifestation of extremism in this country. It might not be a flashy event like Unite the Right, but on a day-to-day basis, we're seeing hate crimes really terrorize communities around this country. And of course, we need action from social media companies and the private sector. There are social media companies that can act and might act with pressure. And then there are those who have built entire business models on giving a home to extremism. And if they won't act, we need domain registrars, web hosting companies to take action, because we know that deplatforming these extremists, making sure they don't have an unnecessarily large audience or voice, has major impacts on their ability to recruit and to operate. Again, don't take it from me. Richard Spencer said it as much in our case, where he said, because he's been deplatformed, he can't go about his business. And so it requires this sort of whole of government and whole of society approach. Civil litigation, though, plays a really crucial role.
We're going to get to some questions in just a second that draw on that. But before we do, Karen, I wanted to ask you about the downstream effect of this. Have you seen any of the individuals that have come on your radar and Unite the Right? Has there been any overlap organizationally or individually in the January 6th attack as far as you've seen?
Yeah, so as Amy said before, there is some overlap. Our defendants, however, I think potentially due to the deterrent effect of this lawsuit, were not on the Capitol premises on January 6th. And many of them have said that this suit has affected them financially. And then, we have received from the court sanctions against a number of the defendants. And just, it's, I am obviously a trial lawyer, so I think about these things a lot. It's very, very unusual to get pretrial evidentiary sanctions against defendants in a case. It just nearly never happens. And so in our case, due to the extreme discovery misconduct of the defendants, which included destruction of evidence, the court has already found a racially motivated conspiracy to do violence as to some of our defendants, and has already levied financial penalties, and in one case threw somebody in jail for a little while due to their discovery misconduct. So I do think the downstream effects are undeniable, both in the micro sense and we hope, frankly, in the macro sense. I mean, I am just a big believer that, it's one thing for me as a lawyer who used to work in government, to stand up in court and say, these people need to be held accountable. It's a second thing, even better, for the judge to say it. But for a jury of regular people from the Western District of Virginia to see all the evidence in the case, probably the first time that all the facts of what happened that weekend will be told to any group of people, if they can come back and return a verdict that says, under our laws, this is not acceptable, this cannot happen in our country, that I hope is the thing that has the most downstream effect. And that's really, for me personally, that is what, is motivating me. I believe in the power of a jury verdict. And so hopefully we will get one here that we like.
Don, could I just say one thing?
Of course you can.
I'm going to take off my federal official prosecutor hat now and speak personally. There is obviously a big role for government agencies to play in this space, and FBI and ICE HSI and the Justice Department overall doing a lot of really good work. But I've always believed that there is a big role for civil society and private citizens to play, to do the kind of heroic frontline work that the Anti-Defamation League has been doing for decades, that Integrity First is doing now, including in the Kessler suit. These are essential undertakings for the protection of our citizenry, for the protection of our country. I am pleased to see that civil remedies are coming into greater use. So not only the KKK Act that Integrity First is using, but libel laws, which we're now seeing used. That can be a very powerful weapon in this battle, and I'm very, very pleased to see it. End of personal comment.
Fair enough. So now we're going to get some questions from folks, and because we've got around 15 minutes left. Eli, I think this one is from you, from Mark Vogel. If they, I believe the people that Unite the Right had conspired to commit violence, isn't that a criminal act? And if so, why hasn't the DOJ prosecuted?
Well, DOJ has. I'm not the authority on those cases. The Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice is. FBI, of course, also is. And a variety of cases have been brought, including the man who drove the car in Charlottesville was prosecuted and convicted.
Yes.
So it does happen, but there's a much broader reach, I think, in the use of, for instance, the KKK Act.
And I'll just add to that.
Yeah, please.
That I think, the impetus for Integrity First for America being founded in 2017 was perhaps gaps that might exist in this space. And so it made it all the more important for us to bring this lawsuit in the aftermath of Unite the Right, because we weren't sure what was necessarily going to happen. And so I don't want to speculate about what might happen in a different world. If Charlottesville would have even happened in a different world, there's a lot to say about that. That is probably for a different discussion another time, or a sort of choose your own adventure book about the narrative arc of the last 5-6 years in this country. But I think that recognizing where there are gaps was the biggest impetus for us to bring this, or rather for IFA to be formed and to support litigation like this.
If I could put my DOJ hat back on, I would say also, I believe what you're seeing is something approaching at least at the Department of Justice, a so-called whole of government kind of approach to combating these things. As an example, my office, Human Rights and Special Prosecutions Section, which brings suits against not only Nazi perpetrators, but human rights violators from the conflicts in Bosnia, Rwanda, Guatemala, Ethiopia, and elsewhere. We've detailed some of our top legal talent to the U.S. Attorney's Office in the District of Columbia to work on the January 6th cases.
Is that right? That's interesting. That's very interesting. Karen, Ruth asks, what legal arguments are the defendants making in the Charlottesville suit?
A great question. Also, I just want to say, as to the last question, as a former Garland clerk, I have to say, I do think this is an issue that he is so well equipped to handle as Attorney General. And frankly, there's nobody I would rather see in that job right now. So I just want to mention that. So what arguments are the defendants making? One argument that they made at the motion to dismiss stage that was rejected by the court was that the First Amendment protected the conduct that we had alleged. And what the judge said, and the law in the Fourth Circuit is very strong on this, and this is sort of incontrovertible, but the First Amendment does not protect violent activity. Similarly, if you talk about how you're going to rob a bank and then you rob a bank, it's evidence about the bank robbery. It's not, it doesn't protect you from liability for having robbed the bank. So that's one argument that did not fare well at the motion to dismiss stage. And the judge said, if we prove the facts that we alleged, that the defendants would be liable under the law for their conduct. Another defense that they bring really is the self-defense defense, which is to say, there wasn't an intent for there to be violence. The discussion that seemed very threatening leading up to these events were just jokes. And then actually it was the counter protesters who showed up, who really initiated the confrontations, and the people on the side of the white supremacists just reacted to that, and violence ensued. And so one of the witnesses that we have at this trial is an expert really in white supremacist tactics and communication. And so this idea that when you post things or you write things, you want to say it in a lighthearted, joking manner so that later you can say, it was just a joke. I was just joking. So there are a lot of posts that are very threatening, very violent, and then they end with like an LOL. So, look, I was just joking. And so we really, so we have, as a witness in this case, one of the premier experts on white supremacy in America, who's going to tell our jury, here are some of the tactics that are used as a general matter, and they basically are all seen on display in our case. So we think that will be very helpful to the jury.
Interesting. Eli, this question is from Mark. Does the government track money that's funneled to hate groups? He says, like Richard Spencer's, but let's open it up to, in general, what is the process on that?
No. Once again, I wish we had a colleague from the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division. So that's actually outside my lane, outside my area of expertise. But the FBI has made clear that they are closely monitoring links among groups and the way that violent groups are able to amass resources.
Amy, let's get this one. This one's for you. This is sort of a broader existential / strategic question, but can rational discussion persuade extremists that their views are wrong, or is that a waste of time?
Existential questions. We have many of them in this case. And sometimes I choose to focus on the more practical ones because the existential ones can be quite daunting, like this one. I think I generally, and maybe I'm cynical, I think that there are certainly those we can persuade, but there are those who are too entrenched in their beliefs that rather than persuade them to come to the light side, the correct side, we simply have to marginalize them. We have to push them back into the shadows where they belong. And that is a potential impact of this case by making clear the consequences for taking those violent and hateful ideas and turning them into real world action. I think this speaks to, of course, the First Amendment distinction in this case as well, that if the defendants had simply gone to Charlottesville with their vile, abhorrent views and their Nazi paraphernalia and chants, that's protected conduct in this country. And as horrific as I find it, and as all of us probably find it, they have every right to believe that. But that's not what happened in Charlottesville, and that's not what's happening in this country right now. There are far too many people emboldened and empowered to turn those beliefs into real world action. And we need to make clear, put this movement on notice, that there will be consequences for doing that. And so maybe again, I'm cynical, but I think while we can change some hearts and minds, we can't change all of them. And what we can do is just make very clear the consequences and push them back into the shadows where they belong.
The best opportunity, I would say the best opportunity to shape hearts and minds is when people are young, with children. And so there we're talking about the obligations that fall to our nation's parents, our teachers, our faith leaders, to do a better job of teaching tolerance.
I agree with it. Shout out to the museum, which does really
Absolutely.
important in this
Yes.
regard.
All the museums that are connected. Karen, let me give this one to you, and it's related to what Amy just asked. But how does the Skokie March relate to this discussion?
Well, that's an excellent question that I've never really thought about. One thing I want to say though, and one reason I was a little bit distracted is we have met people in the course of this case who have left the movement. I think sometimes these people are women who kind of look at the effects of what happened, and they say, this is not what I was in this for. And so I agree with what Eli said. I do think, you have to educate people before, they become invested in this way and in these groups and make these connections. But it is not impossible for people to leave the movement. And I think that's important. I mean, maybe I'm not as cynical as Amy, which is really shocking if you knew the two of us. But I do think that that there are ways for people to decide this isn't for me. I mean, certainly not. There are a lot of people who don't fall into that category, no matter what we said, that it would not be persuasive. But there are people, and we have run across them in our case.
That's hopeful. Eli, we're running down on time, but I think this is a fascinating question having to do with your macro work. Have other governments besides the U.S. and Israel engaged in serious Nazi hunting efforts? So
yes, for the most part, the countries of Europe, start there, gave up on this on these efforts by 1950. The German government sporadically prosecuted cases, including some very, very important cases like the Auschwitz multi-defendant trial in the early to mid 60s, the prosecution of Franz Stangl in the late 60s, and some others. And since 2011 or so, when the Germans prosecuted one of our best known former defendants at DOJ, John Demjanjuk, as was mentioned, they've become more aggressive, albeit at a very late, almost too late date in those cases. The Canadians followed, in a sense, our model and started prosecuting these cases in the 1980s. The last of those cases, it was announced today, came to an end. A man named Helmut Oberlander was revealed today, died on Monday. And he was up in Ontario and was the very last Nazi criminal in court anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. He had actually in 1995, after he was charged in Canada, fled to Florida, where he had a condo. And a colleague of mine and I dropped in on him. That was an interesting day. Happened to have been the exact 50th anniversary of VE Day, May 8, 1995. And we sent him back the same day to Canada, but his case was languishing in court for some 26 years.
So the last Nazi in Canada just died.
Last one that was prosecuted in the Western Hemisphere.
Fascinating. We're just about out of time, but Amy, I want to give the last word to you. As you and Karen work to bring this to trial, what do you hope will be the impact of this case?
There's so much we hope for this, but I think it's pretty simple. I think at the end of the day, it's about accountability and justice at a moment when it's been sorely lacking. Accountability for those responsible for the violence 4 years ago, who have faced so little, who are so deeply connected to the broader extremism we're facing. Justice for our plaintiffs who are so incredibly brave, who've taken this horrific weekend that they survived and channeled it into this case, which will have impacts that extend well beyond their communities, well beyond Charlottesville. Of course, justice for Charlottesville, which I think, as Karen described, having a jury trial of residents of the Western District of Virginia holding these extremists accountable who attacked their community. There's power in that. And because of the power in that, it also really leads to broader impact. The deterrent effect we hope that this has, not just in bankrupting and dismantling the specific defendants in our suit, but deterring others from being a part of this violence. And as has been alluded to here, the power of a trial to really capture the public's attention, educate the public, make people understand the crisis that we're facing, the ideology that's at the core of how these individuals and groups operate, the violence that's at the core, and again, the consequences that we need to make sure happen for being a part of this. We are certainly going to make sure that the impact of this case, the legacy, the story of this case is told well beyond this fall. We go to trial on October 25th, so it's starting very soon, finally, after 4 long years of Karen and our team tirelessly litigating this. But we hope that the legacy is one that extends far into the future, not just into in terms of the tangible impacts on the defendants and the justice for Charlottesville and our plaintiffs, but in the deterrent effect and the legacy that this case has and the model it provides in the fight against extremism at a time when it's really needed.
Well, I want to thank you all for a fascinating discussion. Eli, Karen, Amy, thank you so much. And Ari, why don't you come back and close us out?
Thank you all for being here. John, if it's okay, I'm going to ask one last question, which I think is an important one. How can our audience members get involved in supporting the trial if they're right there with you guys?
Well, I'm so glad you asked. Thank you. I think there are some links in chat, and perhaps you'll be sent them after the fact as well, or you can go to integrityfirstforamerica.org. If you sign up for updates there, we'll make sure that you get regular updates of what's happening during trial. It is not easy to necessarily sit on a conference call line all day to listen to what is happening in the courtroom if you are an average citizen. And so we want to make sure that, again, the story of this trial is heard around the country and around the world, and we'll be sending out regular updates. We are also holding a large pre-trial event featuring in partnership actually with the museum and featuring Jack Klieger, among many others, next week on September 30th, and folks can sign up for that on our website at integrityfirstforamerica.org and learn more about this, hear from all sorts of other experts in this space about the fight against extremism. And again, we'll be sure to keep you apprised as we proceed towards trial.
Both the museum and ADL New York, New Jersey are supporters of Integrity First for America's work, and we urge our audience to get involved, help cover the legal fees, and make sure that this case is a success. John, thank you so much for helping us understand this issue more deeply. Karen, Amy, Eli, thank you for sharing your expertise with us. We'll stay in touch with everyone. Good luck at the trial. And we will share an email with our audience tomorrow that includes a recording of today's discussion and some follow-up links, including John's new CNN series, Reality Check Extremist Beat. Wishing everyone a great afternoon.